before the world had edges, before rivers had names, before any sailor had looked upon the horizon and wondered what lay beyond it. There was water, and within that water, older than memory, older than the gods who would one day claim the heavens and the earth and the underworld between them, there moved something vast, something patient, something without beginning and without end. His name was Oceanus. He was not a god of the sea in the way we might imagine. He was something far older, far quieter, and, in his silence, something far more powerful than any god who ever hurled a thunderbolt. To understand Oceanus is to step back to a moment before mythology made sense of the world. Back to the age when the Greeks looked out at the water surrounding their world and asked themselves a question that still whispers beneath every great ocean voyage, every storm, every tide that pulls against the shore. Where does it all come from? The answer they arrived at was not a place. It was a being, a titan of unfathomable scale, a river so immense it encircled the entire known world, flowing endlessly around its rim like a great serpent curved back upon itself, eternal, circular, and without pause. Oceanus was one of the first titans, born of Uranus, the sky, and Gaia, the earth. In that first thunderous generation of divine beings who preceded the Olympians by an age that has no name, while his siblings would be swallowed, imprisoned, overthrown, and scattered across the stories of gods and heroes, Oceanus endured. He did not fight in the Titanomachy, that great celestial war in which Zeus and his siblings tore the cosmos away from the old order. He simply remained, calm, present, flowing. His domain was not limited to the waves of a single sea. Oceanus was considered the source of all the world's water. Every river, every spring, every well sunk into dark earth was understood in the Greek imagination to draw ultimately from him. The Nile rising from its mysterious southern source, the Danube curving through cold northern lands, the Euphrates threading between the cradles of civilization. Every one of them in the ancient mind was a tributary of Oceanus, a gift flowing inward from that great encircling river at the edge of all things. And it was not only water that fell beneath his quiet dominion. The creatures of the deep, the sea nymphs and river spirits, the strange forms that moved through water in half-remembered dreams, many of them belonged, in lineage or loyalty, to him and to his wife Tethys. Together, this pair of elder titans produced 3,000 sons, known as the Potamoi, the river gods, and 3,000 daughters, the Oceanids, who presided over springs, clouds, rain, and the soft borders between water and earth. 6,000 divine children, born of one ancient union, spreading like water through every corner of the world. He was, in other words, not merely a being. He was a system. He was the hydrological soul of the ancient world, given a face, a name, and a quiet, unhurried temperament. In the documentary that follows, we will draw slowly closer to this great and gentle titan, to who he truly was, and why. Thousands of years after his worshippers have passed from the earth, the ocean still carries his name. We will trace his origins through the oldest threads of Greek cosmology. We will meet his vast family, rivers and rain and ocean nymphs, and understand what their existence meant to the ancient world. We will explore how artists depicted him across centuries of pottery and mosaic and carved marble. We will sit with the mystery of why this most powerful of titans chose peace when all around him chose war. And we will follow his name as it traveled out of myth and into the language of science itself, where it lives to this day in the word we use for the planet's great interconnected sea. There is no hurry. The ocean, as Oceanus himself might remind us, has been flowing for longer than any story. It will continue long after this one ends. So let us begin, gently as the tide begins, at the very edge of the world. Segment 2. origins and the cosmogony of the ancient world. In the beginning, before the beginning, every civilization that has ever looked up at the night sky has asked the same question. Not the question of who lives among the stars. That is the province of religion, of comfort, of the long winter evenings when stories are most needed. The deeper question, the older question, the one that has no comfortable answer and never has. Where did any of this come from? Where did everything begin? For the ancient Greeks, the answer arrived not as a single moment, not as light dividing darkness in one clean stroke, but as a slow, generational unfolding. A family drama played out on a cosmic scale, in which the world was not created so much as it was born. And Oceanus, our great titan, stands at the very root of that family, not at its beginning. There were forces older even than he, but close enough to the origin that to understand him is to understand something profound about how the Greeks conceived of existence itself. To find Oceanus, we must go to the text that most completely lays out the Greek account of the world's origin. Written around the 8th century before the Common Era, Hesiod's Theogony, whose title means simply the birth of the gods, is one of the oldest works of literature to survive from ancient Greece, and within its lines we encounter the cosmos assembling itself like something waking from a very deep sleep. It begins with chaos, not chaos in the modern sense of disorder or confusion, but something closer to a vast yawning gap, a formless opening, a space of pure potential in which nothing has yet declared itself. From chaos, the first great forces emerge without parentage, without cause: Gaia, the earth; Tartarus, the deep abyss beneath even the earth; Eros, the force of attraction that drives all creation forward; and two children of chaos, Erebus, the darkness, and Nyx, the night. And then from Gaia alone, without a partner, out of her own immensity, comes Uranus, the sky. And it is from the union of Gaia and Uranus that the Titans are at last born. Oceanus was their firstborn. Before Cronus, who would swallow his children whole. Before Rhea, mother of Olympians. Before Hyperion, lord of the blazing sun. Before any of them, Oceanus came first. 12 Titans in total. 6 brothers, 6 sisters, form what the ancient Greeks called the elder gods. Their names alone carry the weight of geological time: Coeus and Creus, Hyperion and Iapetus, Themis and Mnemosyne, Phoebe and Tethys, and first among them all, eldest of the elder, Oceanus, the great encircling river, already flowing before any of his siblings had drawn their first divine breath. It is important here to pause and consider what it meant to be a Titan in the Greek imagination, because the word has traveled a long distance from its original meaning, and somewhere along the way it picked up connotations of brute force, of rebellion, of tragic grandeur, that do not entirely fit Oceanus. When we say Titan today, we tend to picture enormous, powerful, struggling figures, the losers of some great cosmic war, chained in the Earth's depths for their defiance. And that image is accurate for many of the Titans. But Oceanus was different in nature, not just in biography. The Titans were not simply powerful beings who happened to hold divine offices. They were, in the deepest sense, the personifications of those offices. They were not gods of the ocean the way a mayor is in charge of a city. Present, administrative, removable. They were the ocean. They were the sky. They were memory and law and the turning of the heavenly lights. Their existence and their domain were not separable things. When the Greeks said that rivers ultimately flowed from Oceanus, they did not mean that somewhere, invisibly, he was directing the water. They meant that rivers were, in some essential and non-negotiable way, expressions of his nature. In Homer's Iliad, Oceanus is called the origin of the gods, And in one remarkable passage, the origin of all things, it is a claim so vast that later scholars debated whether Homer meant it philosophically or literally. The answer, most likely, is both. Not the origin of the seas alone, not even the origin of water alone, but all things. This places Oceanus, in at least one strand of Greek thought, in a position of almost incomprehensible primacy. He is not merely old, he is foundational. He is the condition that makes other conditions possible, and yet he is also consistently depicted as gentle, as measured, as a titan who holds more power in his endless current than most gods will ever dream of, and who spends that power not in conquest or dominion, but simply in flowing, always flowing. The river that encircles the world does not need to assert itself. It simply is. And in simply being, it sustains everything inside it. The Greek world, the oikumene, the inhabited earth, was imagined as a disk, a broad, roughly circular landmass surrounded on all sides by water. Not an ocean in the modern sense, with its abyssal trenches and its weather systems and its thousands of miles of open emptiness. Something more deliberate than that. A river. A great, moving, unbroken body of fresh water. For Oceanus, it must be noted, was associated with fresh water in many traditions, not salt, flowing in an unending circle around the edges of all known land. Beyond that river, the world did not simply end. It opened into something else. The realm of the dead lay on its far shore, accessible across the waters of Oceanus, which is why Charon the ferryman is such a persistent figure in Greek death mythology. You had to cross water to reach the underworld, and that water ultimately traced its source back to Oceanus. The Elysian fields, where the heroic dead found rest, were sometimes placed on islands in the far west, in or near the stream of Oceanus itself. The gardens of the Hesperides, where golden apples grew on trees tended by the daughters of evening, stood on his banks. The sun, each night, was said to return from its westward journey by sailing back across Oceanus in a great golden cup, navigating his waters in the darkness before rising again in the east. Oceanus was the boundary of the known world, yes, but he was also its connector, the passage through which the sun traveled home, the road by which the dead departed, the source from which all springs rose back to life. He was not a wall, he was a threshold. There is one final thing to sit with before we move deeper into his story. And it is something the ancient sources themselves debated without resolution. Was Oceanus truly the firstborn of Uranus and Gaia? Or was he, in some older and more primal tradition, older even than that? The Babylonian creation myth begins with water, Apsu, the freshwater abyss, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, mingling together before anything else exists. Egypt's oldest cosmologies place water, the Nun, the primeval flood, before all gods, before earth, before sky. And there are threads in the Greek tradition, older than Hesiod, older than Homer, in which water is similarly the first substance, and Oceanus is not the firstborn child of the earth and sky, but something older still, the thing from which the earth and sky themselves precipitated. It is a question we cannot answer. What we can say, with confidence, is this. In every version of the Greek story, Oceanus is among the oldest. In every telling, he is primary. In every tradition, he flows before the gods who will eventually replace him have yet drawn breath. He was there at the beginning, and whatever the beginning truly was, he was part of it. Segment 3. The Potamoi, the Oceanids, and the sacred family. They understood that water is not passive. It moves. It chooses its path, wearing grooves into stone over centuries, cutting valleys that endure for millennia, rising in spring and retreating in summer, as though it is breathing. Water has character. Water has moods. And a civilization that depended on rivers for its crops, its trade, its survival, its very identity. Such a civilization would not be wrong to sense, behind the movement of water, something alive. The Greeks gave that aliveness a name. In fact, they gave it 6,000 names. Oceanus and Tethys, his wife, his sister, his perfect counterpart, did not rule over a quiet household. Their union produced what may be the most astonishing divine family in all of Greek mythology. 3,000 sons, the Potamoi, each one the living spirit of a river, and 3,000 daughters, the Oceanids, who presided over springs and rain clouds and underground streams and the soft, luminous borderlands between fresh water and everything else. Together, this family of 6,000 divine beings formed something far more than a royal court. They formed a living map of the world. Before we meet the children, it is worth pausing on Tethys herself, because she is, in the mythology of Oceanus, something more than a consort. She is a co-architect, where Oceanus was the great encircling river, the outer boundary of the world's water. Tethys was its inner generative force, the nurturing, distributing power that drew from Oceanus's stream and sent it flowing inward across the land. Ancient writers described her as the mother of clouds, the nurse of the young gods, and the being responsible for directing the world's rivers toward the sea. There is a tenderness to Tethys that balances Oceanus's immensity. He is the horizon, she is the hearth. He flows at the edge of all things, she flows through the middle of them. In Homer's Iliad, there is a quiet and deeply human moment in which the goddess Hera, scheming to distract Zeus from the battlefield, mentions that Oceanus and Tethys have not shared a bed in some time, that some quarrel, some long, old estrangement has cooled between them. It is a detail so domestic, so unexpectedly ordinary, that it lands with particular force. Here are two of the most ancient forces in the cosmos, the great encircling river and the mother of all waters. And they are having a disagreement. Time and distance have placed something between them. It is, in its way, one of the most humanizing moments in all of Greek mythology. And Hera uses their estrangement as leverage. She asks the goddess of love to help her reunite them, knowing that a reconciled Oceanus and Tethys is a more harmonious world. The 3,000 sons of Oceanus and Tethys were the Potamoi, a word that means simply river, singular and plural at once, the way water itself refuses to be counted. Each one was both the spirit of a specific river and the river itself, not the god of the Nile, but the Nile, wearing a face and a name and, in many depictions, the patient expression of something very old that has learned not to hurry. Their number, 3,000, was not meant literally. The Greeks used it the way we use words like countless or innumerable, to suggest a quantity so vast that enumeration becomes beside the point. There were rivers everywhere in the Greek world, rivers of every temperament and scale, from the great navigable waterways that connected distant cities to the smallest mountain streams that appeared only after winter rains and vanished again by summer. And every one of them was a Potamos, a child of Oceanus, carrying within it a fragment of the Great Father's eternal current. Some of the Potamoi were famous enough to appear repeatedly in myth, their characters as distinct as any heroes. The Achelous, the longest river in Greece, winding through the northwest of the mainland, was so renowned and so ancient that some traditions ranked him above all the other river gods, a being of formidable power who could change his form at will. He wrestled Heracles for the hand of Deianira and lost, but his prestige was never diminished. The Greeks swore oaths by the Achelous. That is a measure of how seriously they regarded him. The Alpheus was said to flow beneath the sea itself to reach his beloved Arethusa in Sicily, tunneling through the earth and ocean floor in a journey that defied the ordinary rules of geography. Because love, in the ancient imagination, cared nothing for the ordinary rules of anything. The Peneus was the father of Daphne, whose transformation into a laurel tree beside his banks became one of myth's most haunting love stories, and the Nile, the Nilus, whose annual flooding made Egyptian civilization possible, was claimed by the Greeks as a Potamos, a son of Oceanus, the world's greatest river bearing the blood of the world's greatest titan. Then there was Scamander, perhaps the most dramatic of all the Potamoi, and the one whose story most vividly illustrates what it meant for a river to be divine. During the siege of Troy, Achilles, grief-maddened, unstoppable, cutting through Trojan warriors with the efficiency of a natural disaster, drove so many bodies into the Scamander that the river could no longer flow. And the Scamander rose up. He spoke. He raged. He flooded his own banks and drove his current against Achilles with the full force of a god who has been wronged. This is not metaphor. In the Iliad, this is a battle, the greatest mortal warrior alive against a river, and the river nearly wins. Only the intervention of Hephaestus, the forge god, who sends fire across the water's surface, drives Scamander back. Even then, the river retreats with dignity, unbroken, only temporarily checked. That river is the son of Oceanus. That power, to rise, to speak, to challenge a demigod in open combat, is the inheritance of the great Titan's blood. If the Potamoi were the world's rivers made divine, the Oceanids were something at once more intimate and more pervasive. 3,000 daughters, each one a spirit of some aspect of water or the water-touched world, and through them, the reach of Oceanus extended far beyond rivers and seas into clouds, into rainfall, into the moisture that clings to leaves in the early morning, into the cool darkness of underground springs that no human eye has ever seen. Their individual characters span the full emotional range of the ancient imagination. Metis, whose name means wisdom or cunning thought, was the first wife of Zeus, and so formidably intelligent that a prophecy declared her children would surpass their father. Zeus swallowed her whole to prevent this, and she continued to advise him from within. That an Oceanid should be the source of divine wisdom is not incidental. Water, in the ancient mind, was intimately connected to knowledge. Oracles spoke from spring-fed chasms, wisdom lived at the bottom of wells, prophets drank from sacred streams. Metis, daughter of Oceanus, was the living expression of that connection. Among the 3,000 daughters stood figures whose reach into myth was enormous. Styx, the boundary river of the underworld by which gods swore their most unbreakable oaths. Tyche, goddess of fortune and chance. Doris, mother of the 50 Nereids who attended Poseidon. Nemesis, goddess of righteous retribution. Eos, the rose-fingered goddess of the dawn. And Clymene, mother of Prometheus, which means that the great champion of humanity. The Titan Styx deserves a moment of particular attention. She was the Oceanid who presided over the most sacred river in all of Greek cosmology, the dark, cold boundary water of the underworld, and by her waters the gods swore their most binding oaths. To swear by the Styx was to invoke something so fundamental, so ancient, so close to the original nature of things, that even Zeus himself could not break such a promise without consequence. When gods perjured themselves by the Styx, they fell into a kind of divine stupor, breathless and insensible for a great year, before slowly recovering. The cost of breaking a Styx oath was not punishment from outside, but disruption from within, as though lying by that water disturbed the very order of the cosmos. Styx was a daughter of Oceanus. The holiest oath in the divine world was sworn upon the waters of his child. That tells us, more concisely than any philosopher could, what it meant to belong to his family. Step back from any individual child and look at the family as a whole. It tells us that the Greeks did not experience the natural world as an indifferent backdrop to human events. Every river you crossed had a name and a father. Every spring you knelt beside belonged to a divine daughter. The rain falling on your fields was an Oceanid descending. The underground stream feeding your city's wells was a Potamos moving, somewhere in the dark, with the slow intention of a being who has been moving since before your civilization existed. The world was not empty. It was populated, at every scale, with the family of the great Titan at its edge. This was not superstition. It was a form of attention, a way of insisting that the natural world deserved to be regarded as something more than raw material. That water, in all its forms, was owed the same seriousness you would extend to any powerful, ancient living being. Oceanus did not need temples erected in his honor in every town. His worship was implicit, present in every river crossing and every well drawing and every prayer offered at a spring, because his children were everywhere, and through his children, he was everywhere too, flowing through the body of the known world in 6,000 branching streams, each one carrying something of the great river's nature, patient, persistent, and older than anything that stands on the shore and watches. He built his legacy not in stone, but in water. And unlike stone, water does not crumble. Segment 4. Art, image, and iconography. The face of the deep. There is a particular difficulty that confronts any artist who attempts to give a face to something infinite. The sky cannot sit for a portrait. The sea refuses to hold still. And a being who is, by his very nature, the encircling boundary of all that exists, who flows around the world without pause, without end, without a fixed point from which to regard him. Such a being presents the artist with a problem that is not merely technical, but philosophical. How do you contain, within the dimensions of a mosaic floor or a painted vase or a carved marble frieze, something that is definitionally beyond containment? The artists of the ancient world solved this problem in a way that tells us a great deal about how they thought. Not just about Oceanus, but about the relationship between the divine and the visible. They did not attempt to render him in his fullness. That would have been both impossible and, in a certain sense, impious. Instead, they gave him a face, just a face, emerging from water, surrounded by the creatures and symbols of his domain, looking outward from the surface of things with an expression that manages to be simultaneously calm, ancient, and faintly amused by everything it has witnessed. And that face, across centuries and artistic traditions and the full geographic reach of the Greek and Roman world, became one of the most recognizable images in ancient art. The earliest depictions of Oceanus appear on Greek pottery, those black figure and red figure vessels that served as the primary canvas of the ancient visual world for several centuries. On these vases, he appears most often as a robust, mature male figure, broad-shouldered, bearded, his hair wild with marine growth, seaweed and coral threaded through it like decorations placed there by the sea itself. He holds, in many of these early images, a serpent, a creature that moves in curves, that cannot be straightened, that keeps its own counsel. It is the perfect animal attribute for a being who encircles the world in one great unbroken curve. In other early pottery images, he is shown half submerged, his upper body emerging from stylized waves, while his lower body dissolves back into the water below, as though he is not so much standing in the sea as he is made of it. The boundary between figure and element deliberately unclear. This visual ambiguity was not an artistic limitation. It was a theological statement. Oceanus does not visit the water. He is the water. The edge between the god and his domain is the same edge between a river and its current, theoretically distinguishable, practically impossible to find. On certain vessels, Oceanus appears as the outer border of the painted band itself, his serpentine body encircling the narrative scenes depicted within. The potter has made the medium into the message. Oceanus wraps the stories. The world's events happen within his embrace. He does not participate in the scenes he surrounds, he simply holds them. It is a visual metaphor so precise that no caption could improve it. As Greek art matured through the classical and into the Hellenistic period, the image of Oceanus became both more standardized and more elaborate. The face that emerged from this period is the one most of us would recognize today, should we encounter it on a museum wall or in the pages of an art history text. It is a mask-like image, and that word mask is not accidental, because many of the most famous Hellenistic representations of Oceanus are precisely that, a face alone, set into a field of water or framed by waves, with no body attached. The face is almost always male, almost always mature, not elderly, not youthful, but settled, in the way of things that had been settled for a very long time. The beard flows outward and downward like water itself, its waves echoing the waves of the sea, and from the brow, or from behind the ears, or erupting from the temples like an afterthought of nature. Claws, the claws of a crab or a lobster, curving upward beside the face like a pair of horns that chose an unexpected shape. Those crab claws are the most distinctive and, to the modern eye, the most startling element of the Oceanus iconography. They are also the most revealing. They mark him, unmistakably, as belonging to the sea, not the cultivated sea of sailors and fishermen, but the deep sea, the alien sea, the sea that operates by entirely different rules than the dry world above it. The crab in the ancient imagination was a creature of the boundary, moving sideways rather than forward, inhabiting the threshold between sea and shore, belonging fully to neither. It was also a creature that could regenerate lost limbs, that carried its home on its body, that moved with an unhurried precision, that suggested deep familiarity with currents no human could feel. All of these qualities, consciously or not, attached themselves to the image of Oceanus when artists placed crab claws at his temples. He is the boundary creature. He is the being who belongs to the threshold. He carries his nature with him wherever he flows. When Oceanus appears in full figure form, the objects placed in his hands were chosen with the same precision that ancient writers chose epithets. A serpent, coiling, circular, without beginning, the living form of the river that loops back upon itself at the world's edge. A great urn, tipped to let water pour endlessly from it, the inexhaustible source from which every river ultimately flows. An oar or rudder, marking him as lord and navigator of the current, not merely its inhabitant. Each attribute a sentence, each object a theology compressed into a gesture. The urn, in particular, is an image that would recur throughout the ancient world and well beyond it, across Roman relief sculpture and into Renaissance allegory, and onward into the decorative arts of the modern era. The figure of an old man, or a river god, tilting a great vessel from which water flows without stopping. It is one of the most enduring visual metaphors in Western art, and its roots go all the way down to Oceanus. Every river personification you have ever seen tipping a jar of water, on a fountain, on a coin, in a painting, carries the memory of the great Titan's gesture. It is in Roman mosaic art, that patient, extraordinary craft of assembling images from thousands of tiny fragments of stone and glass, that the image of Oceanus perhaps reaches its most spectacular elaboration. The Romans were enthusiastic inheritors of Greek mythology, and they brought to the iconography of Oceanus both their characteristic love of abundance and their genius for civic spectacle. His face appears on mosaic floors from North Africa to Britain, from the Syrian coast to the Atlantic edge of the Iberian Peninsula, testimony to how completely his image traveled with Roman culture across the width of the known world. Among the most celebrated of these, the Zeugma mosaics from the ancient city on the Euphrates include a magnificent Oceanus panel in which the Titan's face fills the central medallion, surrounded by fish, sea creatures, and the curling forms of marine vegetation. The crab claws rise from his temples. His beard spreads outward in rippling waves. Around him, the creatures of his domain inhabit the decorative border, the whole composition arranged as a world, with Oceanus at its center, and his creatures radiating outward from him. In Carthage, a floor mosaic of remarkable scale shows Oceanus presiding over an entire marine ecosystem. Dolphins and seahorses, fish and lobsters, all arranged around his mask in careful symmetry. These mosaic floors were walked upon. In a temple, the image of a god is placed high, beyond reach, approached with formality. In these Roman villas, Oceanus was underfoot. He was the ground of daily life, quite literally. The children of the household ran across him. Dinner guests stood on him while taking their seats. This was not disrespect. It was something more intimate than respect. It was a statement that Oceanus underlies everything, that his domain is not remote or elevated, but foundational, immediate, present beneath every ordinary moment of an ordinary life. The mosaic artists understood something about Oceanus that the mythographers sometimes missed. He is not a being you visit at the edge of the world. He is a being you are always already standing on. No depiction of Oceanus is complete without his creatures. And the menagerie that surrounds him in ancient art is one of the most beguiling aspects of his iconography. These are not only the familiar creatures of the Mediterranean littoral, though dolphins and fish appear frequently. They are also the stranger animals of a deeper imagination. The hippocampus, half horse and half fish, its forelegs pawing at the water while its tail coils behind it like a great fin. The sea dragon, sinuous and vast, its scales catching light that has never come from the sun. The tritons and nereids, who populate the borders of Oceanus's image as his children and attendants, blowing conch shells, whose sound carries from the edge of the world to its center. These creatures matter because they establish Oceanus not merely as a face or a river, but as an ecosystem, a lord who presides over a living world of tremendous variety and strangeness. The Greek and Roman imagination understood that the deep sea was not empty. It was full of forms that no fisherman had ever catalogued, shapes that arrived briefly at the surface and sank again before anyone could be certain what they had seen. Oceanus was the sovereign of all of that, the familiar and the monstrous both, the dolphin playing in the bow wave and the thing that moves in the dark beneath the keel. All of it belonged to him. All of it lived within his current. There is something deeply comforting in that image. The great face looking out from the deep, surrounded by all its strange creatures, presiding over the full range of what water contains and sustains. It does not threaten. It receives. It holds. It watches, with that faint, patient expression, everything that moves across its surface and everything that moves within its depths. It is the face of something that has seen everything and is not disturbed by any of it. That face, in all its versions, the bearded elder of the black figure vase, the crab-clawed mask of the Hellenistic frieze, the mosaic sovereign of the Roman villa floor, endured for nearly 1,000 years of continuous artistic tradition. And when the classical world faded, and the myths were no longer believed as literal truths, the image of Oceanus survived even so, passing into Renaissance allegory, into Baroque fountain sculpture, into the decorative language of maps, where it appears in the margins of the early modern cartographer's work, the old face of the deep, looking out from the edges of the charted world toward the unknown beyond. He is still there, if you know where to look. S.E. Gemant 5. The Great War. The choice of peace and what it truly meant. The still point of the turning world wars in the ancient imagination did not merely happen. They were necessities, the mechanism by which one age gave way to the next, by which the world was broken down and reassembled into something new. The Greeks understood this not as tragedy, but as structure. The universe, in their telling, moved through epochs the way seasons move. The old must be overcome before the new can fully arrive. And the greatest of all these cosmic overturnings, the war that separated the age of Titans from the age of gods, that drew the line between the old world and the one we have been living in ever since, was the Titanomachy. It lasted, Hesiod tells us, 10 years. 10 years of unimaginable violence waged across the full extent of creation, the Olympians holding their ground on Mount Olympus, while the Titans pressed against them from Mount Othrys to the south. The earth groaned, the sea boiled. Heaven rang with the sound of forces colliding that had never been designed to collide. Even the dead, in their quiet kingdom below, felt the tremor of it passing through the stone above them. Every major Titan took a side. The lines were drawn. And then there was Oceanus, eldest of them all, most powerful of the generation that was about to be defeated, who drew no line at all to understand the full weight of Oceanus's decision, if decision is even the right word for it. We must first understand what the Titanomachy actually was and what it cost. This was not a border skirmish or a dispute over influence. It was a war for the fundamental structure of reality. The Titans, led by Cronus, had held dominion over the cosmos since overthrowing their own father Uranus in an act of terrible violence engineered by their mother Gaia. They had ruled through the Golden Age, that long, abundant era of early humanity that later generations would remember with a grief they could not quite account for. And then the cycle turned on them, as it had turned on Uranus before them, and Zeus and his siblings, released from the belly of Cronus, raised in secret, armed with thunderbolts forged by Cyclopes freed from their imprisonment, rose against their father and his generation with everything they had. The Titans who fought were led by Cronus, with Atlas commanding their forces in the field. Standing with them, Hyperion, lord of blazing light, Coeus and Creus and Iapetus, each one a pillar of the old order. Against them stood Zeus and his brothers and sisters, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, Hestia, joined by the Cyclopes, who forged the weapons of the new gods, and by the Hecatoncheires, those monstrous beings of 100 hands and 50 heads, children of Uranus who had been imprisoned in Tartarus, and now freed by Zeus to fight on his behalf. Several Titans declined to fight for Cronus. Themis joined Zeus, bringing the force of law to the new order's side. Prometheus, reading the outcome with his gift of foresight, also sided with the Olympians. Oceanus stood apart from all of it. The tide turned, as these tides always do, on a gift. The Hecatoncheires tore apart mountains and hurled them at the Titan ranks, with the casual efficiency of beings for whom physical scale is simply the medium of expression. Before such force, even the elder generation broke. The Titans who had fought were bound in chains of bronze and cast down into Tartarus, that deep recess beneath the earth where they would remain, sealed, guarded, perpetually confined, for the rest of time. Atlas, who had led the Titan forces in battle, received a particular punishment: to stand at the western edge of the world and hold the sky upon his shoulders for eternity. A sentence whose brilliance is architectural, ensuring the separation of heaven and earth with the body of the Titan who had tried hardest to prevent the new order from arriving. And through all of this, the 10 years of trembling earth and roiling sea and shattered mountains, Oceanus remained at his river, flowing, unbroken, untouched. The ancient sources do not explain his absence from the war in any single authoritative passage. There is no scene in Hesiod where Oceanus deliberates and decides. There is no speech, no counsel, no moment of declared neutrality. He simply is not there, and his not being there is treated, by the mythographers, as a fact so natural it requires no commentary. That silence is itself a kind of answer. We are meant to understand, without being told, that Oceanus fighting in the Titanomachy would have been as incongruous as the sea choosing a political faction. It is not the sort of thing he does. But there are several interpretations of his absence worth sitting with, because each one reveals something different about how the ancient world understood power, age, and the nature of the sacred. The first interpretation is the simplest. Oceanus was too old and too vast to be drawn into a conflict that, from his perspective, was simply one more convulsion in a cosmos that had been convulsing since before any of the combatants existed. He had witnessed the overthrow of Uranus. He would witness the overthrow of Cronus. He would be present, in his unbroken current, when whatever came after Zeus was in turn displaced, because the pattern was older than any individual reign, and Oceanus, who predated the pattern itself, was not surprised by any of its iterations. To fight in the Titanomachy would have been to take seriously a conflict that, on the scale on which Oceanus perceived things, was a brief and local disturbance. The second interpretation is more politically nuanced. Oceanus, alone among the elder Titans, was never imprisoned. He was never chained, never cast into Tartarus, never punished. Zeus, who was not a forgiving victor, as the fates of his defeated enemies make abundantly clear, left Oceanus entirely alone. Why? The most persuasive answer is that Zeus recognized something the other Olympians perhaps did not fully grasp, that Oceanus could not be overthrown. He was not a deity whose power could be seized and redistributed. He was the world's water. You cannot defeat the world's water. You can contain it, redirect it, work with it, but you cannot take it away from its nature. Zeus was wise enough to know this, and Oceanus was ancient enough to have made sure the knowledge was unnecessary to demonstrate. In Aeschylus's tragedy Prometheus Bound, Oceanus appears in person, one of the very few dramatic depictions of the Titan in surviving literature. He arrives, borne on a winged creature, to offer Prometheus his sympathy and his counsel. His advice: submit, accommodate the new order, bend to Zeus's power, because resistance is futile and suffering unnecessary. He speaks not as a coward, but as one who has watched every order rise and fall, and knows that survival belongs to those who flow around obstacles rather than against them. Prometheus, chained and unrepentant, rejects the counsel. Oceanus departs, saddened but unsurprised. The expression of a river that has seen every kind of stone in its path, and knows which ones will eventually yield and which ones will not. There is a third way to read Oceanus's absence from the Titanomachy, one that does not frame it as wisdom or strategy or philosophical detachment, but as something more essential to his nature. Oceanus did not fight because the war was being fought over a world that existed inside him. The Olympians and the Titans were contesting the mountain ranges and the heavens and the underworld, all of which lay within the great circle of the Oceanus River, all of which were bounded by his current. He was not a participant in the war. He was its container. The conflict took place within him, the way a storm takes place within the sea, violently, briefly, on the surface of something whose depths remain undisturbed. From this perspective, asking why Oceanus didn't fight in the Titanomachy is like asking why the ocean didn't take a side at the Battle of Salamis. He was the medium in which the event occurred. He was not absent from the war. The war was absent from him. After the Titanomachy, the world was divided. Zeus took the sky, Poseidon took the sea, the inner, mortal sea, the Mediterranean and its extensions, the waters that sailors actually sailed. Hades took the underworld. The three brothers drew lots and parceled out the cosmos between them, and the era of Olympian rule formally began. Notice what was not parceled out. Notice what required no allotment, no lottery, no divine decree to remain in its place. Oceanus continued to flow at the edge of the world, as he had before the war, as he had before Cronus, as he had before the Titans themselves were born. The Titans who fought were imprisoned. The Titans who joined Zeus were rewarded with continued relevance. And Oceanus simply remained what he had always been, requiring neither reward nor punishment, because neither category applied to him. You do not reward the river for flowing. You do not imprison the horizon for existing. You accept that it will be there when everything else has changed, and you are quietly grateful for the constancy it represents. That constancy, that patient, unbreakable, unchainable endurance, may be the most important thing about Oceanus. Not his age, not his children, not the vastness of his domain, but the fact that when the world was remade around him, he remained. When a new generation of gods arose to replace his own, he did not resist and was not defeated. He simply continued, flowing, encircling, holding at his edges the entire theater of divine and human events, the way a river holds its banks, firmly, without effort, and for as long as there is water in the world. Segment 6.4. Legacy, Science, and the Living Ocean. The name that outlived its world names are a form of memory. We give things names so that they persist beyond the moment of their encountering, so that the river can be spoken of when we are far from its banks, so that the dead can be summoned back into conversation, so that the things that mattered to us are not swallowed whole by time. And sometimes, rarely, a name is given to something so fundamental, so vast, so woven into the very fabric of experience, that it does not merely persist, it migrates. It detaches from its original speaker and its original meaning, and travels forward through centuries and languages and civilizations, arriving in the present, still carrying in its syllables the fossil of something ancient. The word ocean is one of those names, and its fossil, if you listen for it, is the voice of a titan. The journey from Oceanus to ocean is not a short one, and it is not a straight line. It passes through Greek and Latin and Old French and Middle English, gathering accents and losing letters along the way, arriving in our mouths worn smooth by use the way a stone is worn smooth by water. But at its root, at the very bottom of the etymology where words go when they have shed everything inessential, the name of the great Titan is still there. Okeanos in Greek, Oceanos in Latin, the great encircling river at the edge of the world, whose name we now give to the largest geographic feature on the surface of the earth. The transition was gradual and, in retrospect, almost inevitable. As the Greek world expanded through trade and colonization and the restless intellectual energy of the classical period, the known world expanded with it. The Mediterranean, which had once seemed vast enough to be the sea, revealed itself as an interior body, a lake, almost, compared to what lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules at the Strait of Gibraltar. And beyond those pillars, stretching west and north and south into distances that made the known world feel suddenly very small, was something the Greeks had no existing word for. Something that made their word sea feel inadequate. Something that looked, to the sailors who ventured into it, exactly like what their mythology had always described. An endless, encircling body of water at the edge of everything they knew. They called it the ocean, not because they had abandoned the myth, but because the myth had been right all along, or right enough that its language fit the discovery. Oceanus the Titan, and Oceanus the physical phenomenon traded places gradually, the mythological meaning fading as the geographic one solidified, until the word settled into its modern form, carrying only the faintest memory of the god who had given it its name. Most people who say the word ocean today have no idea they are speaking the name of a titan. They are, every time. The word enters English through Old French ocean, itself from Latin Oceanus, directly from the Greek Okeanos, the name of the Titan. The Greek word's own deeper roots are debated. Some scholars connect it to Proto-Indo-European roots, meaning swift or encircling. Whatever its ultimate origin, the word has been in continuous use, in some form, for nearly 3,000 years, longer than any other name for a natural feature in the English language. The Titan's reach into the modern world does not stop at the word ocean. He appears with a quiet persistence that would surely have amused him, scattered across the language of science like deposits left by a receding tide. The study of the sea itself, oceanography, carries his name in its first syllable. The ancient ocean that once divided the supercontinents of Laurasia and Gondwana during the age of the dinosaurs bears the name of his wife, the Tethys Sea, that vast Mesozoic body of water whose sediments now form the limestone of the Alps and the Himalayas. The compressed seabed of a world that no longer exists. And on the moon, that cold, airless body hanging above our own, the largest dark plain on the near side was named Oceanus Procellarum, the ocean of storms. It spans nearly 2.5 million square kilometers of the lunar surface. The astronomers who named it reached past every terrestrial ocean, past every earthly sea, past every river and spring, and placed the Titan's name on the moon because no smaller designation felt adequate. Even there, at the edge of another world, he was the right name for something vast and encircling and older than the civilizations doing the naming. It is a strangely fitting tribute for a being who was always associated with boundaries, with the place where the known world ends and something else begins. The moon is exactly that kind of boundary. It is the edge of the Earth's immediate world, the first shore of the deeper darkness beyond. Oceanus Procellarum, the great Titan, flowing at the rim of yet another world, just as he always has. There is one final thing the myth got right. So right that it feels less like imaginative coincidence and more like a kind of ancient intuition pressing its face against the glass of the future and seeing something true. The Greeks imagined Oceanus as a single, continuous, unbroken body of water encircling the entire world. They were not thinking of the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Indian and the Arctic and the Southern, the separate bodies. They were thinking of one water, one current, one river, in endless motion around the rim of everything. Modern oceanography, after centuries of mapping and measuring and modeling the planet's water systems, has arrived at a conclusion that would have seemed obvious to any ancient Greek. The world ocean is one. The Atlantic flows into the Southern, which connects to the Indian, which opens to the Pacific, which circles back again. There are no walls between them. There are no true boundaries, only the ones we draw on maps for the convenience of naming. Beneath those names, the water moves as a single interconnected system, a global current that oceanographers call the thermohaline circulation, the great ocean conveyor belt, carrying warm water from the tropics toward the poles and cold water from the depths toward the surface in one vast continuous planetary loop. One water, encircling everything, flowing without interruption around the entire world. The ancient Greeks described the ocean 2,500 years before we had the instruments to confirm it, and they described it correctly. They just gave it a name, a face, and a beard full of seaweed. Oceanus was not merely a poetic image. He was, in some deep structural sense, a correct description of a physical reality that his inventors had no empirical means of verifying. That is what myth, at its finest, sometimes manages, not superstition dressing up ignorance, but intuition arriving by a different road, at the same destination as science. We began this documentary in the dark, before the world had edges, before a single river had a name. We found there, already moving, a being of incomprehensible age and patience, the eldest child of earth and sky, the source of all water, the boundary of everything that existed, and the threshold to everything that did not. We watched him remain still and sovereign while the cosmos convulsed around him. We traced his face across centuries of human art, from the wet clay of a Greek potter's workshop to the polished stone floor of a Roman villa, to the cold and airless surface of the moon. And we followed his name out of mythology and into the word that now covers 7/10 of our living planet. What endures about Oceanus? What makes him worth returning to, worth sitting with, worth the hours it takes to trace his story through the oldest layers of human thought? Is not his power, though he was powerful beyond any easy reckoning. It is not his age, though he was old before age had a unit of measurement. It is his quality of stillness within motion. The river that encircles everything is never the same river twice. It is constantly moving, constantly renewed, each molecule of water completing its circuit and beginning again, and yet the river itself does not change. It is always there. It is always flowing. It is always the boundary and the source simultaneously, the end of one world and the beginning of the next. There is something in that image, something that the Greeks felt deeply enough to build a titan around it, that speaks to a human longing older than mythology itself, the longing for something that persists, for something that holds its form while everything inside it shifts and struggles and transforms, for a river at the edge of the world that was flowing before we arrived and will be flowing after we have gone, indifferent, not in the sense of cold or uncaring, but in the original sense, making no difference between what it receives. Every river flows into it eventually. Every storm cloud empties into it at last. It takes everything in, without judgment, without preference, without end. That is Oceanus. That is what the ancient world understood when it placed him at the rim of all things and let him be, simply and forever, the water that holds the world. He is still out there, beyond the last visible shore, beyond the charts and the satellite maps and the sonar readings, beyond the reach of everything we have built and named and measured. The river is still flowing. It has always been flowing. And if you stand at the edge of any ocean, on any shore, and listen past the sound of the surf to the deeper sound beneath it, the low, continuous, planetary exhalation of water moving against stone, you are hearing something that was old before the gods were born. You are hearing Oceanus.